Hello and welcome to the Arms Control Poseur podcast. My name is William Alberque, Director of Strategy, Technology, and Arms Control at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Berlin. I will be your host as we explore the world of arms control. On each podcast, I will interview the great and the good of the arms control community about a current event related to a treaty or agreement, past, present, or only proposed. Then together we will go, hopefully, deep enough on the history and functioning of the agreement to help you make sense of it all. And, well, that's the idea anyway. This podcast is funded by the European Union Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium. Now let's get underway. All right, and welcome to the Arms Control Poseur. My name is William Alberque, and I am very grateful to have as my guest Anna Péczeli. She is going to talk to us today about some issues. But first, Anna, could you introduce yourself? Give us your full title. Where do you work? All that.
Hi, my name is Anna Péczeli, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And I'm also a research affiliate at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University.
Wow.
But I need to emphasize my standard disclaimer here that I'm here in my own personal capacity, and I do not speak for any of my employers or their sponsors. So this is really Anna Péczeli as a researcher in her own personal capacity. Hold me responsible for everything I have to say to you here today.
You mean you didn't get all of your remarks totally cleared by the United States government, so this isn't the total U.S. government position? This is just yours?
Well, all of my remarks are primarily coming from a research project that we have done 2 years ago on the CTBT issue and an update to the technical debate surrounding the CTBT question. And that publication is available on the CGSR website, and it was cleared through the standard procedures. So anything I say that is based on that research proposal, that's totally cleared and approved.
Okay. And of course, we'll leave a link to that report in the session notes. So tell me, Anna, why are we here today? What's the big issue? What's this report about? What's going on in the world that we should be focusing on here in our discussion today?
The big issue here today that we are going to discuss is the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and its future, because as of last week, the Russian Federation has withdrew its ratification of the CTBT. And we are here to discuss what are the implications of that, what led Russia to make this decision, and what it really means for the future of arms control and also for the future of the CTBT.
Well, and let's put that also in a larger context because, Russia has been using aggressive nuclear rhetoric a lot more since the start of its second phase of its war in Ukraine in February 2022. And I've been really curious. I don't know, have you been following the whole debate going on in Moscow? This guy, Sergei Karaganov, and his papers about needing to restore deterrence. Have you followed those?
Yes, he has been arguing that there is a need for like a stronger nuclear rhetoric, and even he has been floating the idea that maybe the Russian Federation should actually use nuclear weapons against Western European targets to reassert Russia's nuclear status and to send a strong message to the United States. Also, obviously, to send strong signals with regards to the war in Ukraine and make sure that that war can be concluded on favorable terms to Russia. So there has been a lot of nuclear signaling ever since Russia's invasion against Ukraine started in February 2022. And this step is another signal. It's a diplomatic signal in a long line of Russian nuclear threats and saber rattling, and also, unfortunately, in a long line of Russian actions to tarnish the arms control architecture, not just in Europe, but also more globally.
And that's also important as well, that this nuclear signaling just didn't start in 2022 either. Russia's been making threats. I can remember, was it way back in 2015? They threatened to nuke the Danish Navy if they bought Aegis-enabled cruisers. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. I think in the current context, since the war in Ukraine started in February 2022, one of the primary functions of these nuclear threats and signals have been to influence the risk calculus of NATO and the risk calculus of the United States, and to somehow influence to what extent they are willing to get involved in this conflict and support Ukraine. And I think there have been some mixed outcomes of these Russian threats, because on the one hand, I think these threats have achieved their goals because the United States and its NATO allies did not impose a no-fly zone, for example, over Ukraine. And of course, their calculus about the potential risks of doing such a move have been influenced by some of these Russian nuclear threats. And also, obviously, we have seen that from the very beginning, the US administration has been clear that they do not want to get directly involved in this conflict and expand it into a NATO-Russia conflict. So many of the response measures and the support measures that the US and its European allies have provided to Ukraine have been given through the lens of this mindset that they should try to avoid, to the best of their ability, an expansion of the conflict to a NATO-Russia confrontation. But I think on the other side, these Russian threats and signals have not been completely successful, because initially Russia has been threatening military responses if there was any military support going towards Ukraine. Right now, we actually have Abrams tanks and Leopard tanks and F-16s are also in the pipeline going towards Ukraine. So the West is actually providing military hardware to Ukraine to help them fight back the Russians. And we haven't seen that the swift and strong military responses have not been delivered by Russia. So I think there is a very mixed result card when it comes to the efficiency of these nuclear threats. To some degree, they have had an effect on how the West responded in this crisis, but also we see that the West has provided serious military support to Ukraine to help them defend themselves against the Russian aggression happening on their soil.
Right, but I think this perfectly illustrates the limits of nuclear deterrence. On the one hand, it prevents the West from direct intervention. That's clear. That's worked from the start, as you mentioned, no-fly zone or other things that the West has done in other conflicts. So on the one hand, that's working. But on the other hand, the limits of nuclear coercion are clear in order to achieve outcomes. I think this is what people confuse deterrence with coercion or compellence. Deterrence is meant to prevent the other side from thinking that they can intervene, changing the risk-benefit analysis to think that they can't intervene in the conflict. So in that regard, it's worked. And that's why I mentioned Karaganov, because it appears Karaganov is deliberately confusing the terms. He seems to be asserting what a lot of people assert, which is nuclear weapons should let you have any outcome you want. And when you don't get every outcome that you want, therefore, nuclear weapons aren't working. Whereas deterrence, as I mentioned, has a more limited scope. It's supposed to prevent mass conflict between Russia and the United States or Russia and NATO. In that regard, it's worked. But it doesn't give you everything you want. And the United States experienced the same thing in the Vietnam War. And now, the way I read Karaganov's intervention in June and then in September, and then I don't know if you saw this, but on October 5th, he actually spoke at the Valdai conference. Like Putin actually called on him in the audience. And it appears what Karaganov is trying to argue for is more rungs on the escalation ladder. And so it strikes me that CTBT withdrawal is one of those rungs. Is that interpretation right, or am I going off in the wrong direction here?
I think that's part of the answer, definitely. I think another big picture item here that is worth considering is that whenever and however the war in Ukraine will come to an end eventually, there will be a major discussion about the new security architecture in Europe. With scrapping every single arms control measure, starting with the INF Treaty and then the Open Skies, and now the CFE Treaty and the New START Agreement, and now the CTBT is also lingering in the air. I think we almost have a tabula rasa in Europe, and there will be a serious discussion when this conflict comes to an end, how to rebuild that architecture. And basically, a lot will depend on how Russia is coming out of this conflict, whether it will have the strong upper hand in those negotiations and they will be able to dictate the terms of the future of arms control measures in Europe, or whether they are coming out on rather the losing end. And what that means for arms control is again a very different picture. So I think some of these measures have been deliberately nixing out the old Cold War style arms control solutions and creating a blank slate. And we will see how the war in Ukraine will play out when eventually diplomacy will get another chance, and we will see where arms control goes from there. But it seems that none of the old measures will be in place by then, and we will have a lot of freedom to think about potentially new solutions. But also, obviously, it's alarming that many of these guardrails and arms control measures have fallen victim to these renewed competitive kind of new dynamics between the great powers, especially the United States and Russia.
I think, and we could do an entire podcast just on that, but I recall I was talking to a colleague over the weekend, and they said, well, why would Russia want arms control with the United States at all? especially on nuclear weapons, when every argument about every additional warhead has to go through a huge congressional debate. There's a debate, publicly between DoD and U.S. Strategic Command, and essentially we're so transparent, and any change in our nuclear infrastructure takes so long to enact that we're very, very transparent in that way and very predictable in that way. Whereas Russia, and to an even greater extent, China, is completely opaque in that regard. But I did want to talk a little bit about, let's get specific onto CTBT. It's not immediately obvious to me why Russia would want out of a comprehensive test ban treaty, what these recent moves, they haven't fully withdrawn, they've withdrawn their ratification. First, can you tell me a little bit about the comprehensive test ban treaty itself? What does it do? When was it negotiated? What was it supposed to do? Where does it come out of, and all that kind of stuff? And then we can get on to Russia and what they've done today.
So the CTBT, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, was the next step in a long line of initial diplomatic efforts to limit nuclear weapons testing. The predecessors, like the partial or limited nuclear test ban treaty, have limited where nuclear weapon tests can take place and limited these tests to underground tests only. Then there were bilateral agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union, the Threshold Test Ban Treaty and the Peaceful Nuclear Explosion Treaties that put further limits on the upper yield of nuclear weapons testing. And the CTBT was the culmination of decades-long efforts to control nuclear weapons testing. And in 1996, they opened for signature this comprehensive agreement that was meant to ban any kind of nuclear weapons testing that would generate any kind of yield. So, as the treaty was intended, it's true zero yield treaty that doesn't allow any nuclear weapons testing. And when it was opened for signature in 1996, the Clinton administration was very strongly in support of this agreement, and they were the first one in line to sign the agreement. However, in the autumn 1999, the US Senate rejected the ratification efforts of this agreement, and basically, with 48 votes pro and 51 votes against ratification, the Clinton administration really remained short of the 67 votes necessary in the US Senate to get this treaty ratified. And why this is actually important is that this is a special agreement. It has the so-called Annex 2 clause, which names specifically 44 states which are member states of the Conference on Disarmament, and back in the 1990s, according to IAEA standards, had a nuclear energy sector. And these 44 states are actually required to sign and ratify the agreement in order for the CTBT to enter into effect. Right now, even though the agreement has 187 signatories, so it's a massively successful and supported multilateral agreement with 178 ratifications already in place, it's still not in effect today because of those 44 Annex 2 states, 8 ratifications are still missing. And until those 8 ratifications happen, this treaty is still in kind of this weird status of legal limbo, where its verification mechanisms are being built and certified, and they are providing data to the signatories on a daily basis. And they have been actually tested by ongoing nuclear weapons tests by North Korea, and the verification system has successfully picked up all 6 North Korean nuclear weapons tests in the past. But there are certain functions of the organization and also certain verification measures that simply cannot be practiced until the treaty itself is in effect. And one important measure here is, of course, the on-site inspections, because as long as we do not have a treaty that is in effect, on-site inspections cannot be conducted. So the treaty itself, just to sum it up, the basics about the CTBT, it's still waiting on those 8 Annex 2 states to sign and ratify the agreement, and one of them is the US. And as of November the 2nd, the Russian Federation also withdrew its ratification, and now only a signatory, as they claimed, to bring them into the same line with the United States.
So now that means there's 9 states that need to ratify in order for CTBT to come into
That's
effect.
correct.
And that's
Yes.
China, Egypt, Iran, Israel, and the US and Russia, which have signed it, but also North Korea, India, and Pakistan, who never signed the treaty.
Yes.
What's really interesting, and I think it's really worth saying as well, so you mentioned the Threshold Test Ban Treaty, which is between the US and the Soviet Union, which limits explosions to 150 kilotons. And then the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which bans atmospheric and outer space explosions, which are also banned by the Outer Space Treaty. So only allowing nuclear tests underground. And that has a lot of signatories, something like 150 signatories. So it's really interesting if there's a state that is signatory to the Partial Test Ban Treaty, and if the US and the Soviets are still bound by the Threshold Test Ban Treaty, there's still some kind of limits here, but they could both test. And if a state hasn't signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty, like North Korea, for instance, they can test any yield anywhere without any legal ramifications. Is that right?
Yes and no. On the question of North Korea, absolutely correct. They are not limited by these diplomatic measures, so they have been conducting these nuclear weapons tests. Although we have seen that there were ramifications of those decisions, and the international community actually sanctioned North Korea
Right.
for their weapons development and these tests, because there is to some degree a taboo on nuclear weapons testing, and there is like an emerging norm. To what extent this is obligating states, that's really up for debate. But North Korea, who is the only state since in the 21st century who has conducted nuclear weapons testing, has been actually sanctioned for these measures. Getting back to the point on yes and no, I think this question is much better posed to legal experts. But if you sign a treaty according to the Vienna document of international agreements, you are already expected
Right.
to not do acts that would violate the spirit and the basic obligations of an agreement. So even if Russia and the United States are only signatories of the CTBT, based on the Vienna Convention, they are expected to abide by the CTBT spirit and main obligations. So again, this is a legal debate where legal experts could probably go for hours discussing what these obligations mean, but there is some degree of limit and obligation even emerging from the CTBT on the signatories.
No, you're absolutely right. And actually, as someone who I used to be the treaty manager for the Pentagon, and the guidance we had, and this holds for every president, is once the president signs an agreement, unless that signature is withdrawn, you abide by that agreement. There may be things within that agreement that you can't fully execute because they require the legal framework of a Senate ratification. But for instance, if there's a prohibition and the president signs it, then you have to abide by that prohibition until such time as the president withdraws from it. Which brings me, of course, to the other part of the CTBT that's really kind of amazing. Now, if the treaty never came into force, how is it that they have created the International Monitoring System and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization? I mean, I think the IMS, the International Monitoring System, is one of the great achievements in the world in terms of, what is it, hydroacoustic,
Seismic,
and
radionuclide,
detection system, including, there's a radionuclide sensor in
and,
Ross.
infrasound.
Infrasound, right? I think this is really kind of amazing when you look at the scope of it globally, the number of countries these are in, and they're operating right now. It's kind of amazing. How do they get that in force? How do they create the CTBTO without actual implementation of the treaty, without all the Article 2 states ratifying?
Well, basically, the signatories already provide financial support to the CTBTO Preparatory Commission that is running most of the daily business of the organization. There is also the technical secretariat that has been set up, which is the primary body responsible for implementing the treaty's verification provisions. In the treaty, the agreement is that the so-called Article 14 conferences have been provisioned for the case if the treaty does not enter into effect within 3 years of its opening for signature, which is, as we know now, is exactly the case. So ever since the early 2000s, these Article 14 conferences have been convened by state signatories to the agreement, where they are talking about how to bring the CTBT into effect, what measures can be done, and signatories are providing financial support to the organization. And the US actually is the largest financial supporter of the agreement. As of now, according to the CTBT's website, their budget is $130 million annually. And of that $130 million, $30 million is provided by the US government to support the CTBT's mission and to support the IMS systems functioning and continued certification of the new stations coming online. So there is like ongoing support from the signatories, and a lot of this is financial support, but there are also diplomatic meetings happening which aim to bring the treaty into effect. And as I said early on, some functions simply cannot be exercised until the treaty is in effect. But a lot of things are happening. And the international monitoring system, as you said, is a highly successful system that provides data to every single signatory state. And the International Data Center makes these details available, accessible, and also digestible. So the signatories are getting regular reports about the measurements that these stations are picking up and what might be the implication of those measurements.
It's just kind of amazing. It really is. And we'll put a link to the wonderful map provided by CTBTO of the IMS and where all these stations are. And once you look at it, you can't really argue that this is not just one of the really great agreements. But I guess the question then is, why hasn't the United States ratified it? Why haven't more of the Article 2 states signed and ratified the treaty? I mean, aside from a desire to actually test, are there questions about the efficiency of the treaty or its ability, its verifiability, its ability to detect nuclear explosions?
Yes, the two key questions that really guided the Senate debate in 1999 were whether the agreement is verifiable to the zero yield standard that the agreement has foreseen. And the second question was that whether a zero yield standard would put the US at any kind of disadvantage or cause any kind of problem for the United States to maintain its own nuclear weapons stockpile without any kind of nuclear explosive testing. So these were two separate large questions that were heavily debated in the 1990s. I think what we know about these assessments with regards to the CTBT's verifiability is that the IMS system does not have an official standard for verification. However, the design perimeters were 1 kiloton. So the IMS system is capable at a 90% certainty verify the 1 kiloton yield, basically anywhere in the world. There are obviously areas that have better propagation, like, for example, Europe, North Africa, established test sites where down to a few tons, the CTBT IMS system is capable to capture any kind of nuclear weapons tests. However, and these were the two key questions that were discussed in the US ratification case, there were concerns, and these concerns continue today, whether through decoupling means or whether with hydronuclear testing, established and developed nuclear weapon states such as Russia and China might be able to continue to conduct some of these nuclear weapons tests without the IMS system being able to verify their non-compliance or to catch their cheating. So there remains some open questions in the US case whether the treaty can truly catch super low yield nuclear weapons testing activities. And in fact, ever since the 2020 US State Department's compliance report, the US actually officially accuses Russia and China of being in violation with the zero yield standard and accusing both countries of ongoing nuclear weapons testing activities that do not meet the zero yield standard as it's codified in the treaty.
Well, I guess there are three things to say about that. I mean, the first thing is exactly how significant testing is at that very low level. I mean, is there significant design information that we think the Russians and Chinese are getting by yields below the ton level? The other question being, one of the best ways to be able to verify whether or not a test has occurred would be an on-site inspection. I mean, just to be able to go there and send your folks to Lupnor or Nova Zemlya would certainly be able to tell you a lot of information. And then the third thing is just if you could just briefly, without going too far into science, tell us what decoupling is and how decoupling can hide the yield of a nuclear test.
Yes, so let me start with decoupling and then I will circle back to all these other issues. So basically, the idea behind decoupling is that with smaller yield nuclear weapons tests, you could go underground into cavities, and salt domes have been found to be specifically useful geological structures to do decoupling activities. And in large enough cavities, when you do a nuclear explosive test, then of course there's some seismic shock waves that go through the geological structures underground. But with decoupling methods, you could reduce the factor of that shock wave on the geological structures around the test. And it has been found that if you conduct these tests in salt domes, for example, then you could reduce the yield of these tests with a factor of 70. So from a 1 kiloton yield, you could go down all the way to like 15 tons, which with the IMS's different monitoring stations, it's almost impossible to capture or to actually verify. So you could really reduce the yield of a few tons of yield further down where it just remains below the threshold of the international monitoring system. Of course, each state has its supplemental intelligence information and other measures to verify compliance with treaties. So does the US with its own national technical means. But still, it remains a distinct possibility that there might be a decoupled nuclear weapons test conducted by either Russia and China in the right way. With the right techniques, could be gone unnoticed by the CTBTO's international monitoring system. The other example I mentioned is, of course, hydronuclear testing, where you could, according to many technical experts that we have talked throughout the process of writing our CTBT report, you could even conduct such a test in a metal containment vessel, which makes it practically impossible to verify that or to capture any of the radionuclide leaks coming out from such tests. So again, there remains a chance that some of these types of tests could be shielded enough and decoupled and kept under the radar of the CTBTO's international monitoring system. With regards to their significance, in the case of hydronuclear tests, we know that from the Cold War period, both the United States and the Soviet Union has conducted hydronuclear tests. These were primarily conducted for the purpose of weapons safety development and checking weapons safety function. So I would say that if the Russian Federation today has concerns about weapons safety, then maybe these hydronuclear tests could have some added benefit. In 2002 and 2012, a panel of technical experts in the National Academy of Sciences looked at these questions, and I think their conclusion from 2012 is still true today, that there might be some limited benefits of these tests for weapon safety. And if Russia is worried about some of its new capabilities, then they might be able to prove certain characteristics of these weapons through hydronuclear testing. However, they concluded also in 2012 that these types of tests are unlikely to lead to new military capabilities that would significantly alter the strategic balance between the United States and the Russian Federation. So in the grand scheme of things, and when we think about dramatic new capabilities, these extremely low yield and hydronuclear tests are unlikely to give a big strategic upper hand to the Russian Federation. However, if you ask technical experts, any new data is valuable, and if these tests are helping to improve weapon safety, then there is some significance for them from conducting these types of tests.
Yeah, but I guess that always goes back to the idea of militarily significant cheating. In a way, maybe we've set up a standard with this treaty that prevents it from fulfilling its own purposes, because quite frankly, Russia's safety of its warheads is, I don't want their warheads not to be safe. But if you could also comment a little bit on what do you think the efficacy of on-site inspection would be? Would that be a game changer in terms of verifiability of the presence or absence of a test, even if it's hydronuclear or if it's decoupled?
It's again a yes and no answer, because yes, of course, if there's radionuclide leakage from an underground test, then of course having the ability to go on site and do an on-site inspection would potentially provide additional useful data to figure out what just happened. However, as I mentioned, with a hydronuclear test, you could do it in a metal containment vessel in the middle of nowhere. So there remains still, despite the option of on-site inspections, a remote chance that there could still be cheating happening unnoticed under the IMS system. So there could be benefits of an on-site inspection, but whether an on-site inspection mechanism in itself could rule out the chances of cheating, probably not entirely.
That's a good place to take a break. We're going to be right back. You're listening to William Alberque on the Arms Control Poseur podcast. Okay. Well, why don't we turn now to Russia, and what do you think they're going to do next? What do you think their withdrawal of ratification of the treaty means? Are they going to still support the CTBTO IMS? What does this do to future US policy? What do you think is going to happen next now regarding Russia?
There's a lot of speculation out there, and I have seen a lot of different articles going very different directions with these Russian steps. Of course, one scenario is that this was just a diplomatic step, and as they said, they just wanted to bring them back into the same level as the United States is right now, and they are not going to withdraw from the agreement. This was a diplomatic signal, and they are not going to resume the high-yield nuclear weapons testing. That's like one scenario. Another scenario is that they might actually decide that they want to withdraw from the agreement and then they go ahead with full on high yield nuclear weapons testing. I'm personally a little bit skeptical about this second scenario because in the past decade or so, when Russia has undergone a massive modernization effort of its nuclear stockpile, it has proved that it is more than capable to develop new military capabilities without a recourse to nuclear weapons testing. So I believe that as far as we can see right now, there is no serious reason for Russia to return to high yield nuclear weapons explosive testing. I would also anticipate that there would be at least some minimal diplomatic fallback if Russia decided to do so. And there would be maybe sanctions against Russia. And of course, I hope that the international community would condemn such an action by Russia. So I think Russia would need to weigh whether there's seriously any military utility from doing that versus how that would actually tarnish their reputation further and what kind of diplomatic measures might follow such an action. And the third option is this in between option where they continue to remain in the agreement as they were in the past, but they continue to conduct, presumably, these super low yield nuclear weapons testing to maintain weapons safety or to gain whatever they want to gain from these types of testing. So there could be an option where they just under the radar continue nuclear weapons testing, but without full on continuing high explosive yield testing as it was done during the Cold War period. So there are many different options. I'm skeptical that they would return to high yield nuclear weapons testing. I think this was a diplomatic and political message. And as far as we can see from their modernization efforts, there doesn't seem to be a reason for them to return to testing for the sake of developing new military capabilities. They have been able to do that in the past, and they can probably continue to do so.
So you think China, the US, and Russia are going to stay where they are for the short to medium term?
Yes, I actually think that from a US perspective, the most important indicator of how the stockpile stewardship program is going is the annual certification of the stockpile. As of this year, for the 27th consecutive year, US Strategic Command and the three nuclear weapons laboratory directors have been able to certify that the US nuclear arsenal remains safe, secure, and effective. So as long as they are able to certify that to the US president, in the US case, there is no reason to return to nuclear weapons testing. Of course, in the long run, very much depending on how the Chinese nuclear weapons stockpile changes and whether they will indeed end up with 1,500 nuclear weapons by 2035, as most recent intelligence estimates suggest, there might be a new debate in the US that will discuss the necessity of potentially new military capabilities, and that will bring back this issue of nuclear weapons testing and how well can you certify new nuclear capabilities without a return to nuclear weapons testing. But as it stands today in the US, there is an ongoing annual certification process, and the US is confident that its current stockpile is safe, secure, and effective without recourse to nuclear weapons testing. In the Chinese case, I think it's very difficult to say anything definitive because their nuclear posture is the most opaque in comparison to the US and Russia. And we don't know enough about the Chinese nuclear weapons complex or how they are doing their own stockpile modernization, how they are doing stockpile maintenance. There's only a fraction of information available in the public space. However, it seems that they are doing something that's more or less similar to the US stockpile stewardship program because we see some similar experiments, some similar efforts ongoing for capabilities such as the Chinese equivalent of the US National Ignition Facility. So they are probably doing something that resembles, at least to a certain degree, the US stockpile stewardship program. However, we have also seen in the Chinese case that they have been able to double their arsenal without a problem and work on their weapons modernization without high-yield nuclear weapons testing, just like the Russians and the US. China also has nuclear testing experience from the past, so they can draw on some of those past experiences. And to close this line of argument, I believe that at the moment we do not see a main reason for any of these three countries to return to high yield explosive testing. However, again, a lot will depend on how these open-ended modernization programs are going to unfold in the future, both in the Chinese and also to a lesser degree in the Russian case, and what kind of debates that might trigger internally in the other two countries.
It is interesting. And when I look at nuclear testing during the Cold War, there were certainly a lot of nuclear tests that we did for political signaling rather than for science. And I was talking to actually some nuclear weapons scientists from Los Alamos, and they were saying all the data we got from all the nuclear tests, it's not as much as you think. And actually, where computers are now, I always use the example that the iPad 2 has more computing power than the Cray 2 supercomputer that we used out at Lawrence Livermore to design nuclear weapons in the 1980s. It becomes increasingly less obvious what the scientific requirement is for testing. And you mentioned, a new type of warhead. What new physical properties are we going to introduce into nuclear weapons because China has more now? It's one of those questions I always get to. And in fact, when I think about stockpile stewardship and the challenges of stockpile stewardship, behoove us to build simpler, easier to maintain warheads in the future rather than more complex, super boosted warheads that you need to swap components out every, 6 months or a year. I just always have a problem with that in terms of military efficacy, in terms of putting, physics on target. I always wonder what is it you would test for? Do you see any need? Are there new physical properties? Is there some new configuration of warhead that you can foresee that we would need where testing is the answer?
I think it's to definitely reinforce what you just said. Even in the Cold War period, the US weapons designers were very clear about the fact that nuclear weapons testing was just one element in the certification process. Nuclear weapons designs were never certified purely on nuclear testing data. There were a bunch of other simulations and calculations and diagnostic measures that went into the certification process. So nuclear weapons testing in itself never was the prime condition for certifying nuclear weapons function and safety, neither in the past and of course not today with the nuclear weapons testing or with the testing moratorium since 1992. As far as I can see from the publicly available data from the NAS studies and also from JSON reports and from US official government documents, as long as nuclear weapons designs are close to or based on the existing nuclear weapons test base, there seems to be a strong confidence that the US can certify these weapons, including even potentially weapons with a new military mission. Right now in the United States, there's this self-imposed policy to do life extension program of legacy warheads from the Cold War period and avoid new military missions from nuclear weapons capabilities. However, based on the existing test base, according to some laboratory director testimonies to Congress, there could even be new military requirements that could be met by new designs as long as they are close enough to the already conducted nuclear weapons test base. So a lot can be done without returning to nuclear weapons testing. However, there's probably a new military requirement that a weapons designer could imagine and would argue to you that this is so new, this has not been tested, it's very difficult to establish the safety margins without testing, where they would actually argue in favor of a return to testing to certify that new weapon type. So again, a lot depends on how these new weapons capability parameters are drawn out and imagined. A lot can be done without returning to testing, but there could be probably different designs where a return to testing might be necessary or might be recommended by weapons designers. I think the US with the W87-1 modernization program, it is proving that this is now the first life extension program in the US case where the warhead will be entirely manufactured from scratch, and its ongoing modernization effort for the W93 replacement warhead for the Navy. It will be the first warhead that is designed specifically against a new set of sustainment requirements. So there's a lot of new mechanisms and manufacturing processes that you can incorporate and do with high confidence. And it has been stated that the W93, for example, is not going to require nuclear weapons testing to be certified. So again, getting back to the main point, Yes and no, a lot can be done, including new military requirements and functions that can be designed and would not require nuclear weapons testing for the certification, but with the caveat that as long as it's more or less close to the existing nuclear weapons test base and we know some data about safety margins and function from the past. At least that has been, to me, an overarching theme that's coming out from different congressional testimonies that I have seen about this question.
And also that brings us back to something that we were talking about earlier, is that nuclear testing as a potential rung on the escalation ladder, that this might have absolutely nothing to do with science, that it just provides Russia with another option in terms of ratcheting up or ratcheting down tensions, and nuclear testing as a part of that. And I think that's something that we have to look at. As you mentioned, there are potentials for scientific needs, none on the horizon right now, but that potential. And then the point of making, a political point by resuming testing, and all the risks that Russia or China would pose by doing that in terms of political fallout. But I don't know. Anything else to say?
This theme definitely is present in recent kind of reactions to this Russian step, and many analysts and researchers argue that this could just be a political signaling measure where Russia will conduct a single test just to send a strong message to Ukraine that this is nuclear resolve and they are not going to back down, and just to remind the world that they have nuclear weapons and they might not be afraid to use these nuclear weapons if the events on the ground are going in the wrong direction for Russia. So this might just be a very strong political signal, one nuclear explosion, just to remind the world that nuclear options remain on the table in Ukraine. And this is a message for the West to stand down with support to Ukraine. And this is also potentially a message to the Ukrainians to remind them that at the end of the day, Russia has the option to use nuclear weapons. So there's obviously that chance that Russia might just use a nuclear weapons test with the intention of a single political message to drive home what many of these signals that we have discussed earlier have been trying to suggest for many years now.
I agree with you. That's a possibility. I don't think that would work. And I think the cost for Russia would far outweigh any benefit. But I think that is a really good place to leave it. So, Anna, thank you so much for talking us through the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty today and what Russia is up to. I think this has been really useful. So, thanks.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
And when we come back in just a minute for part 2, we'll talk to Anna about her life and times. Be back in a second. Here we are back for part 2 of our podcast with special guest Anna Péczeli. So you've got this great job at Lawrence Livermore, CGSR, fantastic, and you're working on nuclear weapons and all these really incredible tasks. When was the earliest point in your life where you thought, okay, I really want, what I really like to study, what I really care about? Nuclear war, nuclear weapons, conflict, Russia, all that kind of stuff. Was there a point early in your life where you were watching some movie or something, or has this always just been, like a mission for you?
No, it was a lucky coincidence, as I think for many people in the field, it's the same story that something happened in the right time that steered you to this direction. In my case, I remember it was 2010 when I was finishing my master's studies in Hungary, in Budapest at Corvinus University, and I was already convinced that I would like to pursue a PhD degree, but I needed to figure out the big topic that I'm going to do for my PhD thesis research. And I knew one thing, that I did not want to continue the thesis topic that I had for my master's degree, which was US-Saudi relations and the situation in the Middle East. I knew I was interested in US foreign and security policy more broadly, but I wanted to steer away from the Middle East. And that's where the lucky timing comes in, because it was the spring of 2010 where I had a few months to figure out my research topic for my PhD thesis. And everything in US foreign and security policy was about the arms control spring. It was about the new Obama nuclear posture review document.
Yeah.
It was about the signing of the New START treaty. It was the first nuclear security summit, and it was a very successful NPT review conference. So there was a lot of writing and exciting enthusiasm around nuclear weapons issues. And I just decided that I'm going to look more deeply into this topic of US nuclear weapons policy, arms control policy, and I will follow that as a PhD research project. And of course, over the course of my PhD studies, I have refined the research and found the one niche area that I was specifically excited about. But where it started, it was really a lucky timing that the arms control spring in 2010 just inspired me to pick up this topic for a PhD research.
Wow. Earlier, though, when you were studying as an undergraduate, you said US, Soviet, and Middle East studies. Is that right?
No. I was writing my master's degree on US Saudi Arabia, Saudi relations after 9/11. So I was very curious how US Saudi relations have been impacted by the 9/11 events, and generally speaking, how the US policy in the Middle East shifted after 9/11. So that was the topic I was researching during my master's years. Back when I finished my degree, the bachelor and master's degree were not separate. I had a 5-year international relations education that in the end gave me a degree, and I had to write one thesis. So that was the main topic I pursued in the last 2 years of my education. But I have to say, honestly, I have no regrets steering to a different direction and pursuing US nuclear weapons policy. My PhD thesis specifically looked into the changes and continuities in US nuclear posture, because when you look at presidential statements and campaign promises, there's such a huge difference between how each presidential candidate campaigned, which promised major differences in US nuclear posture. But when you actually look at the outcome of the nuclear posture review documents, there's such a high degree of continuity, and a lot of decisions just transcend administrations. So I was very curious during my PhD years, what is the reason for that degree of continuity? Is it bureaucratic inertia that prevents revolutionary changes in US nuclear posture, or is it something else? So I had the fortune to have a Fulbright research opportunity to come to the United States, and I spent 6 months at the Federation of American Scientists, and that 6 months really allowed me to interview people, to go to many Washington, D.C. think tank events, get to talk to the expert community here, but also really reach out to government officials and find good mentors who helped me through this process. And that 6 months was really so valuable in terms of collecting primary materials. I think I conducted more than 100 interviews, so a lot of information came out from these direct interactions. And I just stayed on the topic. And ever since my Fulbright Fellowship, I was always on the search for a new opportunity to return to the US, to do a predoctoral fellowship, to do a postdoctoral fellowship. And that's how I landed at Stanford University in 2016. And after a 1-year fellowship there and a half-a-year fellowship at the Europe Center at Stanford University, I was given the opportunity to join CGSR as a postdoctoral fellow. And for the last 4 years, I have been with CGSR, and I'm hoping to stay there for the foreseeable future.
How did the CGSR opportunity open up? Was there an application, or were you just at a conference and
CGSR has a great postdoctoral program, and there was an opening in 2019. There was an opening in the spring season, so I needed to interview and talk about my past experiences and also talk about the research questions that I would be most interested in doing at CGSR. And I was luckily selected. And the CGSR postdoctoral research program provides you the opportunity to do a postdoc for up to 3 years. So it's anything between 1 to 3 years. And I was extended year after year. And after my third year as a postdoctoral fellow, I was converted to a senior fellow at CGSR. So now I'm on a longer term contract and very happy to stay at the Institute. But it's also, I would say, a very challenging environment to be in. It's a great learning opportunity to be surrounded by so many technical experts at the lab who are looking at these questions from very different angles than a social scientist. So this CTBT project, for example, that we have talked about earlier, it was for me an amazing, unique opportunity to work with a nuclear weapons designer on CTBT technical questions. So I brought the social sciences, and I was the person who looked through the historic record of congressional testimonies and hearings and what everybody said back in the day. And my partner and co-author, Bruce Goodwin, was bringing the nuclear weapons expertise and design expertise and technical understanding of decoupling and hydronuclear tests. So for the first time, I was able to ask every single technical question I have ever had about nuclear weapons. And to the degree he was able to respond to these questions in the open space, he actually educated me greatly about many of these technical issues. And it was a wonderful collaboration. This is really what the labs usually preach about, the multidisciplinary cooperations and bringing together people with different expertise. This CTBT project was for me the first and one of the most rewarding opportunities to actually do that in practice. And I really like that at the laboratory we are given a lot of freedom to pursue issues that make us passionate and that interest us. Of course, within the boundaries of CGSR's main research focus areas, but I have been able to shift around many different and exciting topics over the course of the last 4 years. And I already know at least another 5 issues that I'm excited to explore in the future.
Wow, that was quite an answer. You actually knocked off all but one of my remaining questions in terms of inspiration and things like that. Wow, just a great answer. And actually, I had similar experiences as well through my career. Very lucky at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, and also when I was at what is now NNSA, working with folks from the national labs, and not just the weapons labs, but Brookhaven and Pacific Northwest and Argonne as well. I just think the folks who work at the national labs are amazing people, and it's great to just ask them questions and have them, talk about the things that they're most passionate about. But I have a final question for you, and that is, if you could go back in time and give yourself one bit of advice that would change things for you, what would that advice be? What's the context? What would you go back in time and tell yourself in order to change the direction that you've taken to this day?
I love this question. This is definitely a tough one, honestly, because on the one hand, I don't have a good answer to you because I'm really genuinely happy where I am and I would not want to change it. It was a tough path to get here and to be able to settle down and get this position and work here. So I don't know if there was any advice that would help me make it a little easier, but I really don't have any major regrets about the choices I have made. I feel like over the course of my career, I have tried many different paths. And back in Hungary, I was a tenured professor, actually. I was like in line to retire as a professor 3 decades from now. And I just figured out after doing it for a few years that that's not the pathway I want to pursue. I rather wanted to focus on research. I wanted to focus on commenting more on events as they are happening right now. So it was more in the line of like a think tank, analytical type of work as opposed to teaching. So I feel like I have tested and tried many different pathways to find that what I'm doing right now is the right path for me, and I'm really enjoying it. But just to give you an answer, and that's a different answer, but hopefully useful to especially the younger folks who are listening to us today, that one of the greatest advices is that find the right mentors. I have been tremendously helped throughout my career by finding generous people who devoted time to helping me. It was especially true during my fellowship in Washington, D.C., where I collaborated with young nuclear policy networks like the Project on Nuclear Issues at CSIS, where I had the opportunity to engage with wonderful people who then helped me set up my first interviews with public servants and officials. And then that snowballed into more interviews, more introductions, and finding the right people who are willing to invest in educating the next generation, providing their knowledge to young folks who come from Hungary to write a PhD thesis about US nuclear weapons policy, and they helped me get to assistant secretaries in the Department of Defense for an interview. That was amazing and unimaginable, and that was something I did not even expect to achieve when I started my fellowship. But I have been at every step of my career greatly helped by great mentors, a long line of generous people who really invested a lot of time into reading my random draft papers, helping me prepare for presentations, making me introductions, writing me endless amounts of letters of recommendation to different applications that I tried over the course of these years. Many of them did not lead anywhere, but still they persisted and came back and wrote me a new letter of recommendation for the next big application I was pursuing. So I think a great advice to young folks here is to find the people who are genuinely interested in mentoring next generation people and stick to those people, keep getting back to them, and to the extent they are willing to devote their time, use it. Keep asking for advice and help, because I have been really beneficiary of many great mentors and their generous help over the years, and I'm still doing it. I'm still sending out my draft papers to at least 5-6 people to get feedback on it before I even submit it to a journal, and it's always helping me to improve my writing and also my presentations.
That is a great answer. And with that, I think we can sign off. Once again, Anna, thank you so much for being with us today. Thanks for sharing about your past and your background. And thanks for being on the podcast. I hope we can have you on again sometime in the future.
Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure to come to this podcast. And I hope that you enjoyed our discussion about the CTBT. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any further questions on this topic. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll get a lot of requests for mentorship too right away. All right, that's all we have time for today for the Arms Control Poseur podcast. My thanks once again to Anna Péczeli for being here, for sharing her wisdom with us. Thanks also to the EU Non-Proliferation Disarmament Consortium for funding this podcast. Thank you to B. Aubrey Freeman, as always, for the amazing music. See you next time.
I repeat again. I repeat again. I repeat again. I repeat again. I repeat again.